Hello, everybody. It's Sly, your caretaker. Welcome to my new series called Friday the Top 13, where every other Friday I'll be posting a ranking video of a random topic. And for the first one, seeing as we're in 2020, I thought we'd go 100 years into the past and go rank some movies from the 1920s. So here we go, our first ranking. And at number 13, we have a film that came out in 1920 starring the great Lon Chaney himself. That film is called The Penalty. So, in my opinion, this isn't really a horror film. It's more of a crime drama. But back then, if the film featured a main character who has some sort of disfigurement, or if he's missing a limb or something, and he was presented like this villain, then it'd be labeled as a horror film. In this case, we have Lon Chaney playing a mob boss, so more of a crime thriller type film. But because he has no legs, as a child he had his legs amputated by mistake. It was a doctor's mistake, and so he's basically going out for revenge on this doctor. So it's not really a horror film, but because this guy is presented as this big villain who's missing limbs, then it's labeled as a horror film. So I thought this film was pretty good. The thing about old films when they're, black and white with no sound, I kind of fall asleep to them pretty easily. So this one was able to kind of capture my attention for most of it. I had to watch it in two sittings because it does make me tired. I don't know if it's the orchestra in the background with the classical music that plays in like the background that puts me to sleep, but I have a hard time watching films from the 20s. But this one was good. Lon Chaney, if you're not familiar with his work, he's one of the, I guess, horror icons of that era, that generation. So he's always fun to watch. He's a terrific actor. So number 12 is the last film that I watched when I was going through these films for this ranking. It's another one that isn't really a horror film, but it's labeled as a horror film because the main character has a disfigurement. But it's a romance film. It's called The Man Who Laughs. Well, this film came out in 1928, and it stars Conrad Veidt, who's another prolific character actor, in the role of the main character, the man who laughs, and he'll be mentioned in another film closer to the top of the list. I imagine you might know what it is, but this film is about a guy. When he was a kid, he was deformed. He was disfigured by a group of gypsies. His face was cut up to look like he had a permanent grin, and so later in life he joins a traveling carnival, making his fame that way. But then he later discovers that he's actually, I guess his dad was a lord. He's some sort of royal figure. So they put him up to marry a local duchess or something like that, and basically he's made to be a laughingstock of that particular town. So it's another sympathetic character. Who's not really, he's not a villain, but because he's got that disfigurement, it's a horror film. But it's a really good film. It's one that I was able to sit through. Again, this took two sittings. It was a longer film, 2 hours I think it was, which is pretty long for a silent film, I think. But another good one to add to your list if you're doing these 1920s kind of marathons like I was doing previously. My number 11 is a German film that came out in 1923. It's called Schatten, or the American release was called Warning Shadows. I guess you could say that this is the first legitimate horror film in my list, I guess. It's about a wealthy baron and his wife. They're hosting a dinner party, and they have several people, all men, come over for this party. And in attendance to this party is a magician who, I guess, gives them a vision of what might happen if they continue to flirt with the Baron's wife, who's an extremely flirtatious individual. So it involves violence and murder. So I enjoyed this film. Didn't make my top 10 because it's the one that I remember the least. I had to go look up the plot to kind of remember it. I had it written down and I couldn't remember what it was about until I revisited it. But it's one that I was able to watch in one sitting, so that's a good thing. And I remember it just being a fun little story. And yeah, that's my number 11. So moving into my top 10. So number 10 is a film that came out in 1928. It's called La Chute de la Maison Usher, or The Fall of the House of Usher. It's a French film adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe story. And this story is about a man who lives in an old mansion with his wife, and he's in the process of painting his wife, a very lifelike painting, but every time he works on it, his wife gets weaker and weaker, as in that painting kind of like draining, her life force or something like that. Eventually, she becomes so weak she collapses, and the husband and his friends they declare her dead, even though she's kind of just passed out into like a coma or something like that. So they put her in a casket, they put her in a crypt, and eventually she does wake up and then returns to the house where kind of all hell breaks loose. So this film, I thought that the story was kind of simple. If it had just been for that, then it probably wouldn't have made the list, but it's one which its cinematography is what got it on the list. There's plenty of great shots I found in the film. Just simple shots like the leaves being blown by the wind through the hallways of the mansion, and the haunting scene where the wife had escaped from the crypt and is walking back towards the mansion in her white dress that she had been put in the casket in, and yeah, just very haunting imagery. That's why this one made the list for me. So my number 9 is another German film. It came out in 1921, and it's called Der Mude Tod, or Destiny, by Fritz Lang. Well, this film starts off with a young couple who pick up this creepy old hitchhiker who happens to be the Grim Reaper, Death himself. So the young man in the story, he dies, and his wife, the protagonist, she kind of tracks down Death, and he shows her a room that has thousands, millions of candles, and each one of them represents a human life. And you lower the waxes, the further into their life they are, kind of thing. And if they're flickering, then they're about to die. So she starts to argue with the Grim Reaper, saying that love is stronger than death. Give me back my husband, kind of thing. And he points out to 3 different candles that are flickering, which shows that someone's about to die, and tells them that if you can go into these storylines in these different places in the world and you can save these people with love alone, then I'll give you back your husband. So she plays through these storylines, and they happen in various places and times, I think, just various places in the world. And yeah, it's a very interesting story. It's, again, not horror, except for the character of the Grim Reaper, who is super creepy. He's very creepy, and there are some ghosts in some parts of the film, but mostly a romantic film. I like this one a lot. It surprised me. I didn't know what to expect of it. It was in the list of films I wanted to watch from the 20s, and I was pleasantly surprised. It's at number 9. So number 8 is a Swedish film. It also came out in 1921, and it's called The Phantom Carriage. So that movie is about a guy who's talking with his drunk buddies in I think it's a cemetery, and they talk about a legend where if you're the last person to die before New Year's Day, you become the new driver of the carriage who goes around collecting the souls of the dying. So at the time that this film was released, it had garnered quite a reputation for having, these magnificent special effects that had never been done in cinema before, and it's definitely, you can see it in the film, that it's something that was never experienced beforehand. Yeah, it's a great story, and There's some, if you might see some scenes that have that have that may have inspired a modern classic, The Shining, maybe, with the guy busting through the bathroom door with the axe. So that's yeah, that's featured in this film. I don't know if it's a direct inspiration for The Shining, but it definitely feels like The Shining in that scene. But yeah, no, if you haven't watched this one, all of these films you can watch for free on YouTube, I'm pretty sure. And that's one that is one that I'd show to friends and family. It's a fantastic film. Also, more of a romantic film too. There's very little, real horror other than like the ghostly apparitions. And when Buddy freaks out with the axe, that's a tense scene, but nothing really horror-esque. Um, but yeah, that's what you expect from horror from the 20s. But it's still very good. It's called The Phantom Carriage. Check it out. My next film is another film that came out in 1921. You'll notice that most of these films are from the early 20s. I much prefer the early 20s to the late 20s in terms of cinema. Probably the oldest horror comedy that I've ever seen. Sucker for slapstick comedy. This one's called The Haunted Castle. Sorry, not The Haunted Castle, The Haunted House. This one stars Buster Keaton, and it's one that I'd recommend to anybody who's into that Abbott and Costello style physical comedy, slapstick humor, that sort of thing. Buster Keaton plays a guy who works at a bank, and I guess he's framed. There's a robbery attempt, and he's framed by the manager to be the one involved in it. And so he runs off to this house, this abandoned house, which actually a local theater group was using it as a stage, I guess. They're all dressed up as ghosts and skeletons, so Buster Keaton thinks it's haunted, and yeah, it's a hilarious film. If that one's on YouTube, if you want to go check it out. I don't think I don't remember it being too long. I watched it in one sitting. And yeah, it's one that made me laugh. I was surprised. I hadn't heard about it before, so another one that's just on my list that I jotted down real quick to see if it was available to be watched anywhere online for free. But yeah, no, if you like that kind of comedy, that slapstick humor, then check that one out. It's pretty funny. So number 6 is a film that I own, so I'll just stick up the film. It came out in 1925. Starring the Man of a Thousand Faces, once again, Lon Chaney. And that's the Phantom of the Opera. Everyone knows the story of the Phantom of the Opera. It's been readapted time and time again. It's a public domain film, so there's many, many different adaptations of it. And this, by far, is one of the best ones. It's on the back here, it says one of the quintessential horror films. So yeah, a must-see, of course. Number 6, I like it a lot. So now going into my top 5. Up until now, they've been films that I really enjoyed, but now they're films that I love. And I've only got one of them in my collection, and I'd like to seek out the other ones, maybe order them just to have them in there. But starting off with number 5 in my list, a film that came out in 1920. Starring Drew Barrymore as his grandfather, John Barrymore, and that's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Sorry, I had to think about that one. Yeah, another film whose story you're all familiar with. A doctor finds, I guess, a combination of different chemicals, a potion, if you will, that turns him into the guy he thinks he wants to be, a more outgoing, like a party guy, but he turns out to be kind of evil. But yeah, just another classic in cinema, or not cinematography, but cinema, and one that I'd like to add to my collection. It's fantastic. I guess the makeup on Mr. Hyde. I've never seen anything like that being done today, so it's something that must have been quite crazy to see back in the 20s. So yeah, definitely a good one. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Number 4 is another one that came out in 1920, and it's called The Golem, and how it came into this world, I think, is the full title of it. How he came into the world, sorry. And a lot of people just know it as The Golem. Not a lot of people realize that this is actually a prequel to an older film that is now considered lost. I think you can see some scenes of it online, but the full film itself, it doesn't exist anymore. It's lost. So yeah, this one, I guess, I don't know if you'd call that like an early creature feature. It's about a statue which has a spell put onto it. Makes this a living statue out of this this stone giant, I guess you can call him. And yeah, I think his purpose was just to protect the citizens, the Jews of that town. And something goes wrong with him. He kind of loses its mind. I mean, the costume for the Golem kind of looks ridiculous nowadays. It's a funny looking costume, but the story is very captivating, and I thought it was pretty fun. So I flipped the camera over because I actually own number 3. That's from 1920, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, starring Werner Krauss as the Doctor. And once again, Conrad Veidt as the killer, Cesare or Cesare. Yeah, this is a fantastic film in terms of cinematography. Just those fantastic winding streets and those weird buildings. I don't think that's something that's ever been done before. If I'm wrong, please let me know. I'd like to check those films out too. But yeah, considered one of the, or if not the first legitimate horror film ever put on camera. And it's very, very captivating one at that, with the visuals. The visuals in this is what makes the film for sure. It's a fantastic looking film. So this film is about this doctor who works in a traveling carnival, and one of his main attractions is this guy, this what's that word? Somnambulist, someone who sleeps all the time. He has control over this guy, and he can he orders him to commit some murders. Maybe a bit of a spoiler if you haven't seen it, but this film is 100 years old, so fuck. Go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. And this guy you see in the background that you might recognize from Goosebumps. A little hand puppet. I like this film. And my number 2 pick features probably one of the most recognizable horror figures of all time. And from 1922, it's Nosferatu. And believe it or not, this is a film that was almost disappeared forever. So it's a retelling of the story of Dracula. And once I guess the estate for Bram Stoker, when they caught wind of this, they ordered every physical copy of this film to be destroyed. So some of them survived that purge, I guess, and it's become one of the masterpieces of horror. So I really enjoy the story of this. It follows the Dracula story pretty closely, I guess. And the visuals in this is also great. The makeup effect, Count Orlok, he's frightening to look at. I imagine in the 20s it used to be quite freaky. And some of the visuals, I mean, him standing on the boat on his way to his new home is it's very iconic. And finally, number 1. Number 1 is actually the first film that I had watched when I started doing this series. Actually, I had watched it quite a while before I started going through that list of films, because someone had actually suggested that I check it out. And from 1922, it's called Haxen. It's another Swedish film, and it kind of takes form of a sort of documentary style film, but it explores witchcraft throughout the medieval times, and I thought that the cinematography for this was great. It was very captivating. I couldn't look away for a single minute of this film. Even despite its runtime, I think it's like over 100 minutes long, but time passed by like that. I thought it was a super cool film. So if you ever get the chance to, I guess if you ever take the time to check this one out, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And that's my number one, Haxan. So there you have it. The end of our first ranking video, top 13 films of the 1920s. If you liked what you see, give this video a like, a comment, and any suggestions you have for future rankings, just leave a comment. And if anyone in the group wants to maybe join in on a future ranking video, just let me know. I'll have you come in and do a joint ranking sometime. So I hope you all have a great weekend, and yeah, have a good one.